Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of RPGs with Paddy. I'm Paddy. So after a much longer wait than I had hoped for, I'm finally continuing my review of Cthulhu by Gaslight scenarios. Today we're going to be looking at The Eyes of a Stranger, which is the first scenario from the collection Sacraments of Evil. This is quite a pulpy scenario that draws in a lot of different aspects of the Gaslight era. But I can't go into more detail without spoilers, really. What can I tell you before we begin? A famous traveler explorer has invited you to a party in his house. He's been conspicuously absent from the social scene recently, and there are several rumors floating around about why that is. That is about all I can say without spoiling anything. So if you're a player, you probably want to stop here, but if you're a keeper or you're thinking you might run this scenario, or even if you're wondering if it's worth it to buy the quite rare and a little bit expensive book, Sacraments of Evil, this is where it all begins. So let's jump in. Okay, so this scenario is actually quite easy for the keeper to follow along, just reading through it, but it will be much more complicated and difficult for the players. This scenario features a being who can switch bodies pretty easily, so the players won't always know exactly who they're after, and that will change as it goes along. It's very difficult to predict. The scenario actually opens with the sentence, "This scenario may prove frustrating for the investigators." But I think that this can lead to some great scenes, as you'll see as we go along, so don't be too put off by that. I'll point out a couple of the bottlenecks that could come up and some tips about how to get around this as well. But this story is based around the mythos creatures, the Jacobians, or the inhabitants of Jacob, from the story The Challenge from Beyond. And this story was written by a combination of Lovecraft, Frank Belknap Long, Robert E. Howard, C.L. Moore, and Abraham Merritt, I think. I believe the way it was written is that each of them got their own chapter and then took over from the end of the previous chapter. Because when you're reading this, you can feel the different writing styles as it goes on, or at least I could. If you want to read that, I would say go and read it. It's an interesting story, but you don't have to know it, and your players certainly don't have to know it. But there are two key things that you should take from that story. One is the Jacobians. These are enormous purple space worms, and also there is a cuneiformed cube, and this is the powerful artifact which will allow the mind switch between the Jacobians and the humans, which is the key part of the scenario. So back to the scenario. John Bidwell has found one of these cubes in Australia and has travelled back to England where he activated it, maybe accidentally. His mind was then transferred to Jacob, so his mind was switched with the Jacobian. The Jacobian came to Earth, the mind anyway, and Bidwell's mind went to Jacob. And there, in Jacob, he learned some really amazing things because they're a much more advanced race, and he wants to keep learning. Back on Earth, his body was inhabited by one of the Jacobians, and in the story, The Challenge from Beyond, the alien forces have difficulty controlling the human body, so the strange actions of the Jacobian, or Bidwell, ended up with him being sent to an asylum. Eventually, the other Jacobians managed to find a way to free their Jacobian brethren's mind from the asylum. So they managed to switch the minds back. So now Bidwell is back in his own body. Then he starts acting normal again, so he's released from the asylum. But all he wants is to figure a way to get back to Jacob. So now we get to the start of the timeline of the scenario. Bidwell is organizing a party, which the investigators, among many others, are invited to. There's a little bit of limited information you can find out about Bidwell before the start of the party, or maybe they might already know, but a little bit of research is fairly common in these Call of Cthulhu scenarios. He's a well-traveled adventurer with a good education and plenty of money. The rumor is that he had caught an exotic disease while he was on his last expedition, and that is why he has been out of the public spotlight recently. And yeah, you can definitely play that up, but a no roll will reveal that he was actually in an asylum. At the party, this is a great setup. Whatever you think about the rest of the scenario, this is an excellent setup to set up the seeds for all of your other scenarios in the Gaslight era as well, because you can meet plenty of future friends and foes from the greater London area here, especially, more well-to-do off people will be here. There is a suggested list of attendees, which includes some of the links to future scenarios in this book, Sacraments of Evil, but you can feel free to add in anyone you want, anyone you think might be interacted with in the future in your scenarios or in your campaign. But anyway, as there's lots of chit-chat going on, Bidwell will at some point come over and talk to the investigators, and we'll kind of have general small talk. But during that small talk, he will also kind of feel out if they're interested in joining a seance, or if they show any interest in the occult or anything like that. If they do express any kind of interest in this, he will invite them to stay after the party to join in a seance. It says that if they don't join this, they will find out the details of it all the next day. But really, for this scenario, I think it's fairly crucial that at least some of them join the seance, and most players would probably go for this anyway. Another thing it says here is that Bidwell is quite sexist towards women, but I don't think it really adds to his character, and there's no real connection to the story. So personally, I would leave that out. I don't mind having a sexist character if it has some greater storyline in it, but this was just kind of thrown in, and it doesn't seem to have any connection later on, so I would probably just leave it out. But after this conversation, anyway, Bidwell will go around and he will mingle with the rest of the guests. So then the investigators themselves can go around and meet some interesting people. You can set the seeds for future scenarios here, and you can kind of, muddle up what is the main goal of this scenario here. But after he's done chatting to enough people, or at a certain time, Bidwell will call an end to the party, and soon the investigators and a few select other people will be left there who have been invited to the seance. There's a suggested list of names of the people who are staying afterwards, and the scenario says that there should be 13 people present, including Bidwell. So you have 12 guests, and that includes as many investigators as have decided to come. But it is very important, and the scenario I don't think really emphasizes this enough, but the psychic, fairly well-known psychic, Godfrey Williamson, should be present, because he will appear later in the scenario, and it's important that he was there at one point. You can choose anyone you want from the other party members, or any names at all that you want just to be present. They're not important, just that it should be a total number of 13. But even that number of 13 is just pretty random, so you can have as many as you want. There's not much advice given here for how to run the seance, so you'll have to consult elsewhere. But basically, it goes on with a bit of chanting for a while. Sometimes you can make Cthulhu Mythos rolls to see if you recognize some of the words that Bidwell is saying, but there's not much you can learn there. The seance seems to have been a failure at the end, and Bidwell kind of announces it as such, and he thanks everyone present and asks them all to leave. But once everyone is gone, he goes to check the cuneiformed cube, which he has in his closet, I believe, or somewhere in the room. And once he does this, once he touches it, then his mind is indeed switched with a Jacobian. But as the Jacobian comes into his body, it starts to kind of like shake a little bit, or react badly, and his butler hears this struggle, I guess, and he comes in to try and help him. But the Jacobian kind of doesn't have control, or is kind of feral, and kind of attacks the butler. The butler ends up killing Bidwell and the Jacobian, trying to defend himself. But just before the Jacobian dies, he switches minds with the butler. So now the butler's mind is in Bidwell's body, dying, while the Jacobian mind is into the butler's body, and now he's going to escape off into the night. It seems like when you're switching from a human body to another human body, that it's less of a big change for the Jacobian's mind. So it seems to be a little bit smoother throughout the scenario. But it seems like going from a Jacobian body to a human body seems to be worse for them, more difficult for them to adjust. Don't worry about it too much. But basically that's what happens, and the Jacobian escapes off into the night. So during the party, maybe you could have had some interactions with the butler, just to have some kind of connection with him. But I wouldn't go over the top with it either. You don't want to really hammer it home. You can just kind of mention it briefly. But the investigators don't know any of this, and they will find out the next morning when the police arrive at their home. And the police are here to ask some questions about anyone who was at the party last night, but especially anyone who stayed late. So they're going to just ask the investigators what happened. Did they see anything? They might mention that the butler is missing and that Bidwell is dead. Depending on how well the players interact with the police, they might be able to find out some information. It's relatively important that the players do go to investigate the house. So the night before, during the party, you could have some mysterious elements of the house that the players want to investigate, or you could have Bidwell himself kind of make these references to secrets of the house or something like that. Or the police officers could say something kind of particularly mysterious, kind of encouraging the players to go investigate the house. So anyway, if they do go to the house, they will either have to show some police ID or talk their way in or try to sneak in. There's not actually a huge amount to be found, but the key items are: the butler's coat is still on its hook, and it's unusual that the butler, who is missing, would have gone out in the cold without his jacket. You can also find some symbology, which you may be able to link up to the Freemasons, and that is kind of an important aspect. You can find a photo of Bidwell with the cube in Australia. And finally, the main thing really is in the library you can find Bidwell's journals. And this talks about his expedition to Australia. There's a handout with all of the key points, and all of them are kind of pointing towards the cube. While they are here looking through the library, they may notice the sound of footsteps approaching. If they've talked their way in, or if they've shown some police ID, there's no point in hiding because people know that they're around. But if they snuck in, maybe they might want to try and hide. It turns out it is a Scotland Yard detective, Sergeant Mulverhill. He's not actually on the case, but they don't know that. He will threaten to bring them to the police station for questioning, for breaking in, or for sneaking in, or for being here when they shouldn't be. But he probably won't do it because he doesn't want to draw any attention to himself. As I mentioned, he's not officially on the case, but he's here on a personal matter, which again, none of this he will reveal to the investigators. We'll talk about his motivations now in a second, but the investigators may possibly think that, or you might suggest a no roll, that Bidwell returned from Australia shortly before the Jack the Ripper murders. But extra investigation into this will show that he has solid alibis for at least 2 of the murders, so it's not him. But the Freemasons are worried that it might be him, and they don't want any connections revealed between Bidwell, who is a Freemason, and you can find some Freemason symbology around his house. They don't want any connection between Bidwell and the Freemasons if Bidwell turns out to be Jack the Ripper. And that is why Sergeant Mulverhill is here. He wants to kind of make sure there's no connection, there's nothing leading anyone to think that either Bidwell is Jack the Ripper or that there's any connection between the Freemasons and John Bidwell. So Mulverhill is a pretty powerful opponent to cross, but he and the Masons can also be powerful allies or sources of clues, and that's mentioned here in the scenario. So the only other place that the investigators might think to look at this stage is Albrook Asylum. This is where John Bidwell was during his insane phase. If the players haven't learnt about this in their research before the party, then Mulverhill might mention it in passing. But also, there's not a lot to be learned here either. The players would have to take the train up and back, and they can find out that when Bidwell was admitted, he was acting like a savage beast, so he was mostly kept sedated. This kind of could come up a little bit later as well. But one morning, he fell into a coma, and when he awoke, he was back to his normal lucid self. He was kept under observation for a while, but it seemed he was back to normal, so he was then released with a clean bill of health. And that's all that you can learn from this strip. But on the way back, a hard spot hidden will allow one of the investigators to notice a man on the train who was also on the train on their way up. Now, if they confront him, he claims to just be a businessman on a business trip, but really he's a Freemason who's spying on them. He won't reveal this at all, but it's just kind of starting to build up a little bit of the paranoia that they're being watched. So that's kind of a dead end pretty much as to where you are. Maybe they could look around London a bit, but where would you look? There's no information about like the butler at all, like where he might be outside of his working hours or if he has another place to stay. But basically, yeah, there's nothing else to learn until they get a visit from Godfrey Williamson, who is the famous psychic who was at the seance and at the party. He says he's been having dreams and visions since the seance. He can't remember anything clearly apart from a word like Duncan or Duggan or something like that. He also feels that he's being watched by a faceless man or a group of faceless men and that they should watch out. The investigators can interpret this as either the Freemasons, which it probably is, or the alien beings, because they don't know anything yet. This interpretation may change at different points through the scenario based on the information the players learn, but it's probably talking about the Freemasons. So the next big thing that should happen is 2 nights after the murder. So, for example, if the murder happened on a Monday, then the players find out about it on a Tuesday morning. Maybe they go to the house, and then on the Wednesday, they go up to the Albrook Asylum. When they come back, they get visited by Godfrey Williamson. But then that will be Wednesday. Wednesday night is the following happens. A Chinese man, Li Zhao, is arrested by the police for something totally unrelated after running around the Limehouse district. He will say that he, along with 2 of his fellow Chinese thugs, plan to attack a white guy walking around this district. But then the white guy suddenly turned around and snapped the neck of Li Zhao's 2 friends. Zhao just kind of ran away, and then he was arrested because of his ramblings. The police don't believe him, but eventually the description matching Bidwell's butler as the white guy they attacked makes its way up the ranks and the connection is made. So you could, of course, wait until this information makes it all the way through the channels and then for the rumor to reach the players, but I think this is too slow. Kind of up until this point, there's not so much that the players can do. There's not really many leads for them to follow. So I think getting them involved at this stage is pretty essential. This is probably the biggest bottleneck of this scenario, and there's 3 ways really to kind of bring them in a more natural way, I think. So the first one is Zhao doesn't speak any English, he only speaks Chinese. So if any of the investigators have skill in Chinese, they may be brought in to the police station and asked to help translate. Alternatively, if none of the players have Chinese skill, maybe they could be friends with the interpreter who visits them the next day and kind of just brings it up in conversation. The second suggestion is if any of the players have any kind of law connections, they might be asked to come in to help with the babbling loon, especially if the players have some kind of experience with the Limehouse district or dealing with the Chinese gangs. Sergeant Mulverhill may also send them the information if he wants them to clear the Freemasons of any bad press, although Mulverhill's actions later on are a little bit confusing, so just be careful if you are going to use him here. Just try to make his motivations throughout the scenario kind of add up, which, sometimes they don't. And finally, if neither of those options make sense for your party, I suggest that there is a vagrant in the drunk tank that night, and he might have overheard the information. He figures it might be of some value to the investigators. Possibly it's someone they interrogated in previous scenarios, or if they have a public private eye business, or if he happens to stumble across them on the street and overhear what they're talking about, and he just wants to sell that information. Alternatively, if through some kind of combination of events, any of the players have been imprisoned, they might be the ones who overhear the Chinese interrogation. This really is a key piece of information, but the scenario doesn't really show how to involve the investigators unless they're very close with the police. So I would say do one of those options just to get the players into the scenario, really investigating it. Whatever way you've chosen to get the information to the players, it should eventually lead them to check out the Limehouse district. Once they're there, some quick investigation should bring them to Dunnigan's warehouse, where they can find the deceased body of the butler. If they don't think about this, maybe get them to make a roll so they can remember the hint from Godfrey Williamson about the name. Anyway, next to the dead butler, there's a nearby crate where the players can find some books, including the narcotic manuscripts, and you can learn some new spells from that as well. There are also several drawings and mathematical formulae, and at the center of all of these pictures and formulae, there is a strange cube, and the players should probably have seen it by now in Bidwell's house, if they didn't see it on the first night. A further investigation around here will also allow you to find the cube itself, and the scenario kind of assumes that the players will take the cube at the very least. But just then, once they find the cube, there's a shout from outside, and a constable is fighting with a Chinese woman. So this constable either would be, if you came here with some of the members of Scotland Yard, then he's keeping an eye out and stopping anyone from coming in. If you went ahead on your own investigation without involving the police, then just have this be a passing bobby. So the Chinese woman is really desperate to get into the warehouse. So as the struggle is going on, make sure the players, try to have the players kind of come out and see what's going on. And during the struggle, the constable suddenly stumbles back a little bit, and then from the mouth of the Chinese woman comes the voice of the constable shouting out for help, that, she's stolen my body or something. But all of this should be happening very quickly, so the investigators might not be sure whether there's body switching or voice stealing, or if the Chinese woman is a kind of a professional con artist to be able to mimic other people's voices or something like that. But the police officer, who now has the mind of the Jacobian, bolts off down the street. If the players pursue, definitely do a chase scene. If the constable is caught, the Jacobian then will try to switch bodies with whichever player caught up. If that happens, the player's mind will be trapped inside the body of the officer, and the Jacobian will take control of the player character's investigator and run off. So then the Jacobian, one way or another, will escape from here. If it causes some loss of sanity or temporary paralysis when the mind switching happens, the Jacobian kind of has to get away, basically. Whatever body the Jacobian finally inhabited will be found washed up in the Thames in a day or two. So the mind switch, as already mentioned, doing the mind switch should cause a loss of sanity, but especially if the player character, who's, say, now inhabiting the body of the constable, if they see their own body washing up dead, then that should really be sanity shattering for them. If the players didn't think to take out the narcotic manuscripts or the cube or the diagrams, then the Yakubian will try to return later to collect them, but will only go in when it knows the warehouse is not being watched, when it knows it can sneak in. There's no real scenario where you can trap the Yakubian here. So this is just some keeper information now, but in the time between the Yakubian switching from the butler to the Chinese woman, or until it got caught here anyway, it managed to seek out the Si-Fan underground Chinese gang. The Yakubian revealed its god, Juk Shab, to them and explained its plan to open up a gate between Yakub and Earth. The Si-Fan were really impressed by the display of power, and they're totally on board. They're going to do whatever they can to help the Yakubian. So in the back rooms of one of their opium dens, they will start building the necessary machinery from the diagrams and the formulae that are needed for the Yakubian to open up this gate. When the Yakubian inevitably loses control of their current body, just a nameless Si-Fan thug will take the next place. So the longer the investigation drags on from here, the more bodies of kind of known Chinese gang members will wash up, really hinting towards the Chinese gangs. During this period, so during the investigative period, the Yakubian will learn about the investigators' involvement, and if they have the cube, that's when, the Yakubian really takes offense. It will send a message to them, ostensibly from Inspector Cleveland, who's the head detective on the case, to meet them down at the wharf, where something important is happening, and they have to come tonight. As the investigators leave for there, thugs will be waiting for them outside their house, hidden outside their house. So as soon as the investigators leave, thugs will ransack their house looking for the cube. If the investigators have left it behind for safety, then it will be gone by the time they get back. But if the investigators have taken it with them, then it will be stolen in the next scene, which is as they arrive at the wharf, and they're going to be ambushed. So they get down there, and it's foggy, and there's no sign of Inspector Cleveland. Suddenly, they will be surrounded by Chinese thugs who start to attack. I would say let it go like that for maybe a round or two, and it seems really hopeless. But then after that, a gunshot rings out, because all of the Chinese gang members are using just physical weapons as opposed to guns. But then a gunshot will ring out through the foggy night air, and there's a shadowy figure up on the side there, kind of a little bit away from the melee anyway, and he is shooting at the Si-Fan. This is actually Sergeant Mulverhill, the Freemason who's investigating all of this, and he's been keeping an eye on the investigators. He won't get directly involved in the melee, but he will try to help turn the tables in the investigators' favor. Just before he leaves, so he'll kind of keep shooting to kind of make it so that the investigators will probably win. But before it comes to the clear end of the battle, he actually gets hit in the hand with a throwing knife, and he takes off into the dark. That can come up later. The fact that he has an injured hand can come up a little bit later. But this will keep going on anyway. And the Si-Fan will, I'm never sure if it's Si-Fan or Si-Fan, the Si-Fan will retreat after they lose 3/4 of their members, or alternatively, if you feel like combat is just dragging a little bit, you could just have the sounds of the police on their way through, and then the Si-Fan will scatter at that stage. So after all of this dies down, a night or two later, probably a night later, because I feel like there's not quite enough content to be going every day. But anyway, the investigators will have a dream, and anyone who was at the seance will be experiencing the same dream, but none of them know that it's a dream until the end. It's a little bit cliche, but it works. It might be a good idea to subtly note down the player's stats because you'll be returning all of those at the end, apart from any sanity loss. So, what happens is Williamson, the psychic who they've met before, calls over to the house, possibly even waking them up if you want to have that link to the dream. But he comes over and he insists that they have to go to Bidwell's house now. Upon arrival, then it will be dark, cold, and only dimly lit. But Williamson, throughout all of this, is kind of drawing tarot cards and reading the impressions from those. So that's actually put in quite nicely, I think, because I wouldn't know enough about reading tarot cards. It's nice to put that in. But they make their way up to the room where they had the seance before, and as they open the door, Bidwell is there waiting for them, along with the full table of everyone else who was at the seance. Bidwell will then explain his plan about connecting Jakob and our world. Of course, you can try and attack him now, but any attack that you do, so you attack him the first time, and it has no impact except his face will change to the face of the butler. If you attack him again, it changes into the Chinese woman, and again it would go to the constable who he took over, and again, gradually, each time you attack him, he's changing into a new face, the next person that he has assumed the body of. But eventually, anyway, he will stop you from doing all of this. He will then welcome the new masters to this place, and a kind of a gate will open up, and the Jacobians will start kind of pouring out. The players can try and fight, they can try and run, but if they go out into the streets, they'll see more Jacobians pouring onto the streets of London and destroying things, and eventually they will be hunted down and killed, and so you should have the Jacobians actually kill them as well. Once they die, they will wake up from the dream, and all of their stats will be returned except for any sanity loss, and there's probably going to be a fair amount of sanity loss here. So the morning after they wake up, though, they will get a real visit from Williamson. He had the same dream, and he had some other visions as well, again really focusing on the faceless men. If the investigators tell him about the Freemasons, he gets very worried. He probably at this stage decides to move to Australia until things settle down to escape all of this. Another key hint that he gives is seeing visions of a yellow dragon breathing smoke and fire. So definitely make sure to mention that, because otherwise I'm not sure you're going to find out where this is. Well, obviously you will construct a new way for them to find out, but that's the only real hint kind of leading them to it. But anyway, at this point, Williamson will probably try to leave, and if the investigators go out, they should go out with them. As they get onto the road, and he's going to hail a cab, actually the cab that's coming towards him starts going very quickly. The players, if they notice this, they can try and jump out of the way to dodge it, or they could try and jump onto the cab to try and confront the cabbie. It is being driven by Sergeant Mulverhill, and even if you don't get onto the cab and confront him, you might be able to notice that he has the injury to his hand, and you can kind of add all of this up later. Now, I'm not sure if you want to include this scene or not, because it certainly adds a lot of dramatic tension, but if your players stop to think about it or try to figure out, it won't really make that much sense. The only real way, because in the previous time that they met him, first he was just a normal investigator at the house, then the next time he was saving them from the Seafan, and then now he's trying to kill them? Why? So the only way that I can see that it would make any sense is if Williamson has found out that there's a Masonic connection between Bidwell and the Masons anyway, and maybe he's starting to see some similarities between the time that Bidwell came back and the murders, the Jack the Ripper murders. And for that, Mulverhill maybe wants to kill him before any word of that can get out. Now, so I would say include that or don't include that, whichever you want. But there is actually a great resource here, which is a full page of chase rules for a coach. So I think they're very interesting, but just beware of having to have that make sense in your game as well if they go that way. Anyway, so there's many things leading them to the Chinese gangs at this stage, but the hint from Williamson should maybe lead them when they're walking around. They should see the restaurant called the House of the Yellow Dragon. And you can have like a painting up that shows it breathing smoke and fire or something like that, depending on how heavy-handed you want this hint to be. But you do need that hint there, because once you go in, it's a restaurant. And then once you're in the restaurant, then you have to go into the opium den, the kind of secret opium den behind. And then once you're there, then there's another secret room as well. So them just kind of going in and checking out different places probably won't work unless they know that they have to go to the Yellow Dragon. So, you can find out that this restaurant is connected to Chinese gang activities. And there's even a link to the notorious Fu Manchu. So you can use this as a launching pad for further Fu Manchu scenarios. There's actually a lot in this scenario that would link to that as well. The restaurant, as I said, has a secret opium den beneath it, and you'll probably have to sneak in, pretending that you're there looking for opium. Given the previous ambush that has happened at your house and on the wharf, it's a little bit suspicious that the Seafan wouldn't be on the lookout for these players, so your investigators might think of disguising themselves somehow, but maybe just going into the opium den, there's no questions asked. Anyway, once you get in you will be led to the secret opium den, where there are many strangers partaking of the drug, and they're all kind of minding their own business. If you settle down for a while in the cushions and just relax, you will notice some goons appearing from a secret door behind a large Buddha statue. Now the investigators can try and sneak in there, but this is where it gets a little bit confusing, if it isn't already. 90% of the time, the Jacobian will be in this room. However, if not, then you have a chance to find the following. Of course, the following is still there, but if you go in and there's a direct confrontation with the Jacobian, you're not going to have time to look around. Alternatively, you could find this after the final battle. So anyway, once they get in, they'll kind of see the secret machinery set up, and it will also include the cube being in part of the machine, unless the investigators still have it. There is also a cabinet off to the side, which is coated with poison, which is pretty bad. And inside are some vials of venom, still poison, but not as strong. There's also some scrolls, which you can identify as the 7 cryptical books of Hassan, and they're written in Chinese. There's also a letter from Fu Manchu, and signed by himself as well. I think it's in English. Like, the handout is in English. I think it's written in English. And there's also a Chinese puzzle box, which contains a vial, very small vial, which is kind of an elixir of youth kind of thing. At the other end of the room, there is a shrine, and on the altar is a glowing orb. This glowing orb is or sphere or orb, whatever it is anyway. This is actually the great old one, Juk Shab, who is the god of the Jacobians. So if the Jacobian isn't present here at the time, then you can kind of look around those and poison yourself on the cabinet and stuff like that. But if the Jacobian is present, then once they come in, it will start up the machine. It will start to put the machine in order. You could have it as a luck roll, whether it happens to be starting up the machine as they come in, and then they might be able to sneak in, or as soon as it sees them coming in, then it will start the machine. Either way, several thugs will be kneeling on the floor in front of the shrine, and these will be the new hosts for the Jacobians who are coming through the gate. So one thing which I think is pretty obscure here, but the investigators can notice during this that the Jacobian is starting to chant the same chant that Bidwell did at the seance at the very beginning. If your players think to chant this in reverse, each magic point that they commit to this gives a cumulative 5% chance of cancelling the summoning. Are your players going to learn about that? Or think about that? Probably not. You might want to, if you know your group of players the best, If you want it to go this way, or if you want to kind of give them the option of this way, maybe have Williamson, the psychic, give some hint at some point through the scenario that like powerful spells could be undone with by reversing them or something like that. Just some kind of hint so that this is a possible outcome. It doesn't have to be so heavy-handed. Basically, if you try to interfere in this either by chanting in reverse or by attacking, anything like that, there will be a big brawl here, and Jukshab, the great old one, may well join in the battle as well. If the investigators thought to alert Scotland Yard that they would be going here, then they could now appear in the battle to help, or they might have found out on their own. If the Jacobian is killed, his mind will transfer to another body nearby, kind of any given Seafan thug, and it will just kind of keep switching around until there's nowhere left to switch to. But how do you stop it? Switching is a tough one. There are some solutions given to that here. In the narcotic manuscripts that they found at the warehouse, there is a new spell called Imprison Mind, which would stop the Jacobian from transferring minds, and thus it could be killed. Trap it in that body and then kill it, and it will die. Equally, it could be tranquilized and that way unable to escape its body. Although this one is a little bit hard to even think of, you have to think back to the asylum where they kept it sedated and it didn't seem to escape. So basically that's the end of the scenario. There's a list of rewards and penalties here, but it really depends so much on the individual path your party took during this. They may be on good or bad terms with any combination of Scotland Yard, the Freemasons, the Seafan, who will not be totally disbanded after this, and even Fu Manchu. So overall, I think that this story has a lot of good, interesting points. It's quite pulpy. It's quite a good bit more pulpy than most of the Cthulhu by Gaslight scenarios, with kind of a large number of fights. It's got Chinese gangs and even Fu Manchu, who's kind of the classic pulp villain. So if you're looking for a less pulpy scenario, maybe give this one a miss. But it does have kind of it even has like Jack the Ripper as well. Oh, the idea of Jack the Ripper murders connections. So it does have a lot. If you're looking for a pulpy Gaslight scenario, this is probably it. There are also a few strange bottlenecks here, where the players may feel that they're at a dead end, or there's not really a way for the players to get certain information. The start of the scenario doesn't really have that much time for them, or any leads for them to follow, really. And of course, the Chinese prisoner is probably the biggest example of this, but I've given a few workarounds for that. Hopefully that will help guide you through. Similarly, some of the motivations of the NPCs here are a little bit unclear. Like I mentioned before, why does Mulverhill go from saving them in one scene to wanting to run them down the next time we see him? Oh, that's another point I forgot to bring up. If Scotland Yard come and attack, you may be able to find Mulverhill as part of the Scotland Yard force that's trying to help them, but then you can see that he's got his injured hand and you can make the connection and kind of make an enemy of him. But all that said, it is a fun and pulpy, exciting adventure using a relatively lesser-known entity in the Jacobians and Jukshab. The scenario starts by saying that it might be frustrating not knowing who is who, but I think a good keeper can use that and even the rather cliche dream sequence to increase the paranoia amongst the investigators about not knowing what's real or who is who. Also, the message from the Jacobian pretending to be Inspector Cleveland helps build up this paranoia. So that is all for this scenario. If you like the video, I would appreciate it if you left a like and if you considered subscribing. If you think anyone you know might enjoy learning about this or is considering buying the Sacraments of Evil book, share the video with them. And my next video will look at the next scenario in the book, which is the masterwork of Nicholas Forby, which I won't get into spoilers now. All right, so that's all for today, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.